Okay, I'm Clive and this is Andy, and we're here at Bike Lab, and we're going to run you through some basic setup tips for your bike. We're going to swap all the parts from one frame over to another. We're going to run you through some frame preparation. Some of this stuff you're going to be able to do with your own tools in your own tool shed, and some of it you're going to have done at a specialist bike shop like us. Okay, so we're going to run you through some basic frame preparation. One very important first tip: most bikes nowadays are made of a very high-tech material. Aluminium, some even carbon fibre and titanium. And most frame manufacturers recommend you do not clamp any of the frame tubes in a work stand. So it's really important when you're working on a bike like this one to clamp it on the seat post. So we're going to make some preparation to this frame in order to fit the parts on that we need. One crucial thing: the new style Shimano bottom brackets, not just Shimano, but Raceface, Travative, lots of other manufacturers are bringing out this style, where the bearing is located in the cup that sits on the outside of the bottom bracket shell. Now, most manufacturers won't warranty the cranks and bottom brackets unless the frame has been faced. Now, what that means, if you can see the bottom bracket shell here, and you can see that when this frame has been painted, there's still some paint left on the outer edge. Now, that means there's going to be inconsistencies in the actual diameter, and that means that the bearing might be sitting at an angle. So we're going to take away a little bit of material here on the bottom bracket shell just to make sure that everything fits together square. Okay, so what we're doing now is we're going to take a little bit of the material away from the bottom bracket shell. So we're going to use some cutting fluid, which is always important when you're going to be taking away some metallic material. And this is the kind of thing you want to get a bike shop to do, because it's not worth spending hundreds of pounds on specialist frame preparation tools if you're only going to fit your cranks once or twice. So normally a shop would only charge you maybe sort of £10 or £15 to face your bottom bracket shell. Okay, and bear in mind that not all shops make the investment that we make in all these specialist tools, so you might have to phone around to find a shop that's got a decent set of tools to do this job. If you take too much material away from the bottom bracket, you actually change the width, and then you'll have all kinds of problems with the bottom brackets fitting in the frame. So really you're just taking the paint and the very edge of the material away. If you start taking off millimetres of material, you're going to have yourselves a whole other problem. Okay, so now we've faced the bottom bracket shell, we're just going to run a thread cutter through the bottom bracket shell itself, just to make sure that any swarf from cutting the face of the shell isn't stuck in the threads. So it's basically just cleaning the threads out. Again, this is a different tool to the one we've just used. This is actually this has a thread cleaner or thread cutter on both sides, and we're just going to run it through just to make sure everything's clean and nice. This is the kind of job you want to get a bike shop to do. It's not worth spending the money on these tools for frame preparation on the odd occasion. Okay, next step in the frame preparation, we're going to do the same thing to the head tube. Now, we've got no threads in the head tube, so we're just going to face and ream the head tube. So we're going to take material away from here, but we're also going to make sure that inside here, where the cup goes, there's no imperfections. Again, some manufacturers like Chris King don't warranty their headsets unless you have the head tube face and reamed. Now, this frame's actually been pretty well prepared at the factory, but we're going to give it the once over just to make sure. So this is a double cutting action. Not only is it going to clean out the internal diameter of the head tube, but it's also going to make sure that the face of the head tube is nice and square for the headset cup to fit in. It's not going to take much material away, it's just going to take away any imperfections in the manufacturing, any burrs or paint residue that might be left there from when the frame was welded or painted. As you can see here from all this swarf, this is all the excess material that we've managed to take away from the internal diameter of the head tube or the face of the head tube. Correct frame preparation is absolutely crucial if you want to get the best performance out of your bike. You can't take it for granted that any frame manufacturer, regardless of how upmarket or niche they are, has really taken the extra time to prepare the frame, because they do rely on the shops to do some preparation when they're building the bikes. So if you do buy a bike, buy a frame mail order, or you buy a used frame from a friend, it's definitely worth taking it to a shop and getting this stuff done, because it will make the frame last longer and perform better. Okay, one of the last bits of our frame preparation here today is to face the disc mounts. Now this is particularly crucial if you want your disc brakes to actually work, and what we're going to do, the same as we did with the bottom bracket and the head tube, is we're just going to make sure that the two mounts that the caliper actually attach onto the frame are absolutely square relative to the axle. So we've got this special tool here. This tool is actually made by Magura. It's the one that most bike shops use, and it's basically a cutting tool that makes the disc mounts square. Now we've been open for 3 years, and we've probably been through about 4 or 5 cutters. So as any cutting tool, it eventually becomes blunt. But we do every bike that goes through our workshop, because there's no way disc brakes can work properly unless you do this process. We're just going to put the cutting tool into the caliper hole, and it's going to put a little bit of cutting fluid on. Now it looks like this frame's already been pretty well prepared at the factory, but we're just going to go around it just to make sure it's 100%. So now this is going to make sure it cuts it absolutely square at the same angle that it did the lower mount. And now when we put our disc caliper on there, it will be absolutely square relative to the axle of the hub. If somebody bought a frame in for the disc mounts to be faced, we normally charge £10 a bike. Yeah, so front and rear, so forks and swing arms or the back ends of hardtails, we normally charge £5 a mount. So 10 quid to get your disc brakes working from a decent bike shop is money well spent. Okay, so now we've prepared our head tube, we're going to fit our headset cups. Now there's plenty of ways you can do this. If you want to do it at home with a hammer and a bit of wood or a vise, you can, but bear in mind, if you want to get the cups in completely square, again it would be best to take it to a shop and get them to charge you a minimum labour charge to fit the cups in with a proper cup press. This is a Park Tools cup press. This sort of thing would cost you about 250 quid, so again, not the sort of thing you need to buy yourself, but for us in a bike shop it's an absolute crucial tool. Now before I put the cups in the frame, I'm just going to put, Andy's going to put a little bit of frame prep lube inside the head tube. Now some mechanics like to put lube in the head tube, some don't. Andy doesn't like doing it. I like to put a little bit in there as an anti-seize compound, just to make sure that a couple of years down the line, if you're riding in bad conditions, the frame cups haven't seized into the frame. So now we're going to put our cup press in. Okay, now we're ready to squeeze it in. It's always good to make sure you get your logo on your headset all lined up, and then basically, now we've correctly prepared the frame, that should be squeezed in very smoothly, very effortlessly, and absolutely square. And there we go, new headset fitted. Okay, so we fitted new headset cups into the frame, but now we would need to fit the correct crown onto the forks. Now this is a simple one because this is a split crown, which means that it'll actually come off just with your fingers, like so. But there are other crowns that aren't split, and then you would need to either use hammer and a screwdriver from underneath, which is a good old-fashioned method. Alternatively, you could use one of these bad boys, which is a crown race puller. So as you can see, that clamps onto the crown race and pulls it up nice and square. So now we've got the old one off, new one goes on, and this is where you're going to need to get that on nice and square. And again, of course, we've got the proper tools to do the job. Again, this is probably something I'd recommend you get a bike shop to do, because it can be quite hard to get the crown on. Some people use a bit of pipe to bang it on, but if you damage that bearing surface, that could affect the performance of the headset. So we're going to use a special tool on there. Can be a little bit noisy because we're now going to bang the crown on. So as you can see, that special tool got the crown on nice and square, no damage to the fork, no damage to the screwdrivers or pipes. Okay, now we're going to fit the forks into our new frame. Now it might be a good idea to measure the length of the head tube and compare that to the old donor frame, because we're going to need to figure out if we're going to need to cut any length off the steerer tube, which is good news. The bad news would be the steerer tube would be too short and we need a new pair of forks, but that's a different story. So we're going to put a little bit of grease in the head cups, because even though this is a cartridge bearing headset, it's still possible for some rust and contamination to form between the cups and the headset bearings. So a little smear of grease around there, one bearing on. Follow the instructions for the headset very carefully. As you can see with these bearings, they go in a specific way. They've got a chamfer on one edge that's a much bigger angle than the other edge, so make sure you follow the instructions carefully. So cups, bearings, this is called a compression ring. That's what actually keeps the bearing from wobbling around. There's your top cap. Now we're ready for our handlebar stem or spacers. Okay, we just checked this stem versus the length of the steerer, and we found that we needed a couple of spacers, so we put on 5mm spacers. You can get those from a bike shop for pennies. Okay, and stem's now on. As you can see, there's a small gap between the top of the stem and the steerer, and that allows us that when we put the top cap on, that actually preloads the bearing and takes the stem down to where we need it to keep the headset tight. Just going to put a little smear of grease on that. Pop that in. Now bear in mind, if you're fitting a new pair of forks and you're not sure where you want the height, you can always leave the steerer a bit long, and you can always run a couple of spacers on top of the stem. That gives you the ability to put it down or up at a later date. Okay, we just started putting this back together and we've noticed that this bolt is going in a bit wonky. That's probably because the star nut wasn't fitted correctly in the fork in the first place. A lot of people just put the bolt in the star nut and bang it down. Again, we got a special tool to make sure it's in nice and square, which we'll show you now, and it's definitely worth getting that square, because if you do put the bolt in an angle, then it might not preload your headset correctly, so your headset could constantly be loose. It's called a threadless nut setter. It weighs a ton. If I screw that in, if you look at the angle of that, you'll see how badly put in that was in the first place. So I'm going to try and straighten that up. As you can see now, it's pretty square, much better than it was. Not perfect, but it would have been perfect if we'd have used this to fit it in the first place. Okay, most people wouldn't have a special tool to fit the star nut in the fork, so again I'd recommend you take it to a shop and let them fit it in for you. But if you want to do it yourself, most people put the bolt into the star nut and just hammer it down. That does risk damaging the threads, but if you are going to do that, do it slowly, take your time. And a little trick that I normally do is, if you squeeze this bottom part of the star nut in a vise, you normally find that sits in the fork a bit square before you even start. But for a few quid, get a bike shop to do it. Another popular over tightening method is the star nut. This does nothing but preload the bearing. All it does is pull the headset tight and stop it from moving backwards and forwards. So many people over tighten this to the point where they actually pull the star nut out of the fork. So all you need to do is get that nipped up snug so the headset hasn't got any wobble in it. Now on this stem here, we've actually got a 4-bolt stem, and it's very important to make sure that you do the bolts up equally. If you do the stem up so it's at an angle, it could create a pinch on the steerer tube, which could create a stress riser that could result in failure. So handlebar stems at the back and at the front, it's always good to make sure that you've got the same gap top and bottom when you tighten them up. So now we're going to fit the bottom bracket into our new frame. Now this is one of the new style Shimano bottom brackets, which is found on XT, XTR, Saint and Home group sets. I'd strongly recommend you read the instructions, because as you can see I've got 3 2.5mm spacers here on the bottom bracket shell, and you would need to check the compatibility of your frame to make sure which ones you use and where they fit. Now we're putting this into a 73mm bottom bracket shell without a bottom bracket mounted derailleur, so I'm actually going to remove 2 of the spacers, and we're going to keep 1 spacer on the drive side. It's really important on these new style bottom brackets that you do follow the instructions for these spacers, because if you were supposed to have a couple of spacers in and you didn't follow the instructions, as you tighten the crank arms up, all you're going to do is squash this plastic sheath in the middle, and that will make your bottom bracket completely useless. Okay, so now we're going to fit our Shimano bottom bracket. Most important thing is that we're going to put a nice smear of grease inside both the bottom bracket cups to make sure we can get them out. Now you have to remember that bottom bracket cups are left and right specific. They're going to be clearly marked on here. You can see R and L, and R is the right side, which is the drive side. Now bottom bracket cups should go in very easily. As you can see here, this one's going in by hand. If it's not going in easily, you need to stop immediately, because the threads in the bottom bracket shell are very fine. They're very easy to damage. So if the bottom bracket isn't going in by hand very simply, there's a problem. Stop. Find out what the problem is. Okay, now also remember that bottom brackets have a different thread on either side. Here Shimano have made it really easy in that they actually put a direction arrow on the cup to tell you what way to tighten. Okay, now we've got the cup tightened up as much as we can by hand. We're going to use a tool just to finish it off. Again, don't over tighten anything. There is a recommended torque setting that you can follow, but if you haven't got the right torque wrenches, just use a bit of common sense. So if you can see me here, I'm going to put the spline tool on, finish it in, and when I can feel it getting to the end of the thread, we're just going to nip it up. Now that's going to be ready to go. Okay, now we're going to refit the cranks. Now you can see on the axle you've got these raised sections. This is where they're going to be hitting the bearings. So again, you want a little smear of grease on those. And we're going to drive that in through the drive side, and if you need to, you can get a small rubber or plastic hammer just to tap it through, just to make sure that it's in all the way. Okay, now we're ready to put the left hand crank on. Again, nice smear of grease on the splines. Might be a good idea at this time just to put a little bit inside for where the retaining cap pulls the crank arm on. Now on these cranks you'll find that you have small teeth sections in the middle, so it's actually not possible to put this crank on in anything but one position, which is the right position. Next thing, you've got your small retaining cap. Now a lot of people think that this is a crucial part in keeping the crank on. These are what holds the crank on, the actual pinch bolts that clamp onto the axle. All this does is it preloads the bearings. So you need a special tool to tighten that in. So that's going to pull the cranks nice and tight. It's going to preload the bearing. Okay, so now we've tightened on the crank arm to preload the bearing. We're going to tighten the crank bolts, which actually holds the crank arm on. As you can see here, we have a nice long Allen key. If you put your hand all the way at the end and use all that leverage, you would definitely over tighten the bolt. So I'd recommend just using a shorter Allen key and getting a good grip at the end, getting it nice and snug, not too tight. Alternatively, you can use the correct torque keys. In this case, it needs setting to about 10 to 15 Newton meters, which is pretty tight. It's very important to check these bolts pretty much every time you ride your bike, especially if the cranks are new, because they will have a tendency to loosen up after the first couple of rides. So I'd strongly recommend you check them during the first ride, and then every few times you go and ride your bike, I'd recommend you check your crank bolts. Cool. Here on this bike we got 2 different fittings for the front and rear brake. Well, first of all, front and rear brakes are not interchangeable. They are a different mounting. But on these ones here, as you can see, this front caliper has just a 2-bolt mount that goes on the fork, whereas this rear caliper has an adapter. So the caliper fits onto the adapter and the adapter fits onto the frame. This style is pretty good because it allows you to swivel the caliper, which means it's easier to set up rather than putting all the shims in. The front one, that's going to need to be shimmed individually away from the fork, and they can take quite a while to set up. Okay, in order to fit this rear caliper on this frame, we're going to need to disconnect the hose, because the hose has to be routed through the swing arm. So this is quite an unusual design on this bike. Mostly the hose would just clip onto the frame. So we're going to disconnect the hose, we're going to run the line through the swing arm. But before you do any work on a disc brake system that's hydraulic, you must take the pads away, because if you start working on this and you've got hydraulic fluid leaking everywhere, you're definitely going to contaminate your pads. So before you start anything, make sure your hands are clean, make sure you take the pads out, keep the pads and the disc away from the bike, and then we can start disconnecting the hose and putting it through the system, reattaching and bleeding the system through. Okay, so this system here, pads are inside the caliper, they're held in with this split pin. Okay, so now we've got the split pin out. It's just a case of squeezing the pads together. Most brake pads have some kind of spring mechanism that holds them into the caliper and pushes them back away from the rotor. Okay, so now we've got the pads out, we're going to disconnect the hydraulic hose. So the pads and the disc away from our working area, because now we've taken that out, we've got some hydraulic fluid which has caused contamination. So this is the olive, and this is a compression fitting. Basically the brass compression fitting in the end is designed so that if this system gets really hot, the black plastic hose doesn't contract under the heat and pull out of the olive. So basically the olive and the compression fitting work together to keep the hose in position when it gets hot. Okay, so now we're going to cut the olive off, otherwise we won't be able to get the hose through the swing arm. So here again we've got a special tool, and we're just going to give that a quick snip. As you can see, that's a really nice clean break. You can actually buy one of these from a shop for less than 10 quid. It's a wise investment if you're going to do a lot of work on disc brakes. Alternatively, if you haven't got one of these tools, if you're very careful, you can use a Stanley blade or a Stanley knife, and as long as you cut it against a nice flat surface, you should be able to get a good cut. But that's basically what you're aiming to achieve. You need a really clean, sharp cut. You can use cable cutters to cut the hose down, but unfortunately if you use cable cutters you won't end up with a finished end that would allow you to get the olive on and get the compression fitting in. So if you do use cable cutters to cut the hose to length, I'd then recommend that you use a Stanley knife or a hose cutter just to trim it to get it nice and sharp. Before we put the hose through the swing arm, you've got to make sure that your cable routing is going to be correct for how you want the bike set up. So here the cable is going to come down, bearing in mind that a lot of fork manufacturers now state that the hose shouldn't be rubbing on the crown or the leg of the fork, otherwise it can void the warranty. So you really don't want the hose too long so it rubs on the crown, because that could cause some damage. If you imagine that keep rubbing away, you could cause some damage to the crown. So you want to keep that nice and taut, but you still want to be able to spin the bars around without the hose getting snagged. And then route it through, and then here we're going to go through this hole straight into the swing arm and out the other side to the caliper. Okay, so after a little bit of fiddling about, we got the hose through the swing arm. It's come out the other end. So we are now going to bolt the caliper onto the frame. So we've already faced the frame. We've got some Loctite still on the bolts. And same as any other bolts on the bike, if you haven't got a torque wrench, just make sure you use your common sense not to over tighten the bolts. So the caliper's fixed. We can worry about the alignment of the caliper later. All we want to do right now is cut the hose down to length and reconnect the hose to the caliper. So now we're going to cut the hose to length. So I'm going to allow myself just a nice little kink. And bear in mind that the hose actually goes into the caliper, so you don't want to cut it too short just at the mouth of the caliper body where the hose goes in. You're going to need to allow yourself probably about 7 to 10 millimeters of additional hose. Okay, now we're ready for the new olive and the compression fitting. So this is the nut that holds everything in place. That goes on first. And then the olive. Some olives are directional. Again, it's really important to refer to the manufacturer's instructions on each particular disc brake system. So some olives do actually have a sharp edge on them. So olive on, and then compression fitting that goes into the hose. Now these have to be a tight fit. So here we're going to use these hose clamps to actually grip the hose, so they won't cause any damage to the hose. And then just going to use a hammer just to tap it home. Perfect, dandy. Thank you. Okay, so the compression fitting's on, the olive's ready. There's the nut. We've put a little bit of grease on the olive and the nut to make sure everything's going to go in. Now you want to be doing that up finger tight, and then when you think it's about to stop, you want to make sure that you push the hose all the way into the caliper. And now we're ready to tighten it up. And again, as I've mentioned many times already, make sure you don't over tighten it. This is an instance where we're going to actually use a specific torque wrench, because if we over tighten that and the disc brake fails, we're looking at potential injury. So this is a specific torque wrench we have to make sure these compression nuts are done up to the right torque setting. Okay, there we go, tightened up to the correct torque, and now we're ready to bleed. Okay, now we're ready to bleed the system. The first thing that you need to do when you're going to bleed a disc brake system, apart from keep the discs and the pads away from the area, is undo the master cylinder and retighten so that the top of the reservoir is pretty much horizontal, because we're going to need to get some fluid in and out of the system, so we've got a nice flat surface to work from. Now we have to undo the master cylinder top cap. This one's a Phillips head screwdriver fitting. Make sure you get a nice sharp head. Some of them are a Torx key fitting. It's really important, like anything in life, to use the right tool for the job. Just ask your girlfriend. Okay, so this is the master cylinder top cap. This is the master cylinder membrane. So this expands and contracts with the temperature changes of your brake fluid, and that is the brake fluid. In this case it's a Shimano system, so it's a mineral based fluid. I can't stress at this point how absolutely crucial it is to use the right fluid in your disc brake system. If you do not use the correct fluid in your disc brake system, not only will you risk a severe injury through malfunction, but you could also, more importantly than injury, completely damage your disc brake system, which could cost you a lot of money to fix. Every disc brake system potentially has a different way of being bled. Please refer to the manufacturer's instructions. Alternatively, you can fill your own way and develop your own techniques, but if you're going to do that, be really careful and always make sure you get it checked out before you ride it. So here we're using the proper tools to bleed this Shimano system. This special tool here clamps onto the master cylinder body, and then we have a bottle to catch the fluid that we can just hang off the handlebar grip. Now as we push fluid from the caliper with a syringe up the system, it's going to come through the master cylinder body here into the tube. There's a small hole in this bung here, and the fluid's going to come into the bottle. So now we need to get the fluid into the syringe. So here we have a bottle of Shimano hydraulic mineral disc brake fluid. Again, I'd emphasise you've got to use the correct fluid at all times, and you want to be drawing the fluid into the syringe. With a rear brake system, you really want as much in there as you can. And as you can see here, I've got a couple of air bubbles, so I'm just going to get those back into the bottle to make sure that I do not have any air whatsoever trapped in the syringe. Otherwise it's defeating the whole object of bleeding the system. We're bleeding the system to get rid of any air in the system. We need it to be 100% hydraulic fluid. Okay, so now we're going to push the fluid through the caliper end. Now if you put the fluid through the caliper, there is the potential for the fluid to activate the piston straight away, and potentially the pistons could pop out of the caliper body. So a lot of disc brake manufacturers actually supply you with some sort of spacer that can go in between where the pads would normally be in order to bleed the system. Now this particular spacer doesn't fit this brake, so you can use a tyre lever or anything else that you think will fit up there and keep the pads and keep the pistons from compressing out of the caliper body. But right now we're going to focus on getting our hose onto the bleed nipple. So I'm going to get the fluid right to the end of the hose. Going to get that onto the bleed nipple, like so. Now we're going to open the bleed nipple. And now we can pump fluid into the system, nice and slowly. As you pump the fluid through the system, it's really important with some hydraulic fluids not to make any spillage. Some systems can actually be quite damaging to your paintwork. So we're fine with this mineral system, but if we were using some of the dot-based fluids, it's normally a good idea to make sure you've got an old tea towel or something covering your frame just to protect it from paint damage. As you pump the fluid through the system, make sure you tap the lines with your tie lever or spanner to open the bleed nipple, just to dispel any air that might be trapped in the master cylinder body itself. And then, as you can see, Andy now is going to cycle the lever. That's going to make sure that any air that might be caught around the master cylinder body has gone. Okay, so we're nearly at the end of the fluid, so we're going to stop in plenty of time. We're going to close the bleed nipple, so it's now going to be safe to take that away. That's closed. Once more, just for luck, we're going to make sure that the pistons are fully retracted back into the caliper body. So this is all the fluid that we've siphoned through the system. Okay, so we're now going to take that away. As you can see, the fluid is going to be right at the top of the master cylinder body here, and there shouldn't be any air. So this is our master cylinder membrane, which we've given a little clean. Make sure there's no contamination in there. That's going to sit on top. And there goes a bolt on the floor, but that's why we've got a nice clean workshop floor, so we can find the bolts when we drop them. This disc brake cleaner will work on any hydraulic disc brake system, and it's good for getting disc brake fluid away after you've bled the system, but it's also good for cleaning the rotors and the caliper as well. So I've done the master cylinder, now I'm just going to quickly clean the caliper. Also, it's always good to try and use lint-free workshop towels. If you use like an old woolly rag and you get lots of small particles of lint over your disc brake system or stuck into the disc brake system, then that can cause a leak or contamination. So always try and make sure that you use some workshop rags that are preferably lint-free. Just before I put the pads back into the system, because I've been bleeding it, I've got hydraulic fluid on my hands. If I now touch the disc brake pads as I put them into the caliper, there could be a risk of contamination. So make sure that you keep your hands clean when you're working on disc brake systems, because any oil, grease or hydraulic fluid will definitely cause contamination, and that means new brake pads, and I'm sure you all know disc brake pads can be quite expensive. Okay, these are the disc brake pads that came out of the caliper. And as you can see, the edges of the disc brake pads are quite worn. This may well be because the caliper might not have been aligned correctly when it was fitted onto the original frame. So just to be on the safe side, we're going to whack some new pads in there. It'd be a shame to do all this work and not have the disc brakes working properly. So new pads. Okay, so here's our new disc brake pads. As you can see, these pads are separated by this spring mechanism, and that helps the pads retract away from the caliper under braking. So it's absolutely crucial that you fit that in before you put the pads into the caliper body. Okay, so pads are in. Got to remember to keep the pads in position. On this system here, we've got a split pin that goes through, and then we can just twist the end over to keep it from coming out. Okay, now we're just going to run through rotors, disc brake rotors on wheels. As you can see here, all the bolts are in place, the rotor's still slightly loose. We've made sure that we have used our good old friend Mr. Loctite to stop the bolts from coming undone, and also with small bolt applications like this we would heavily recommend the use of a proper torque wrench. So most of these bolts are almost tight. Just going to finish them off. So you would do that up until it stops, and then you want to do the opposite bolt, then move round, and again opposite bolt. So that clicking noise you can hear, that's when we get the bolt done up to a certain tightness. In this case, on these bolts, it's about 5 Newton meters of torque. Now those bolts are well and truly tightened to the right torque setting. These are Shimano bolts with Shimano disc brake tabs. So as you can see on the bolt, you've got 3 flat sides, and that gives you the ability to get a flat screwdriver under there, push that up against the flat side, and that will stop your bolts from coming undone. If you haven't got a torque wrench, I mean, some torque wrenches can be quite expensive, and taking discs on and off is quite a regular occurrence. So I would recommend you get a pretty short Allen key or torque key, depending on what fitting you have, and you really just want to be nipping it up. It would be particularly useful in that case to have these Shimano bolts with the little plates, because they do stop them coming undone. But as long as you use Loctite, and as long as you use common sense and not to over tighten stuff, then you should be okay. Okay, now we're going to just whip this cassette off. We might want to clean it, we might want to replace it with a new one. You're going to need 2 tools to take a cassette off. You're going to need a chain whip to hold the cassette, and you're going to need a lock ring tool. These are workshop quality tools, but you could probably get these tools for home use from a shop for about 15-20 quid the pair, and if you're taking your cassette on and off regularly, it's a wise investment. So, chain whip on the cassette, lock ring on, You could put some grease on the free hub body before you put the cassette on, but to be honest, it's such a good, easy fit. If you put grease on here, all it's going to do is attract dirt, and the dirt's going to stick to it, so I don't really think there's much need. Just make sure you take it off every once in a while and give it a good clean up. You can put a little bit of grease on there, but really it's not somewhere you want to be putting too much grease. Okay, now we've got the cassette off, we can give the free hub body a little clean. Now, if you're going to use any spray cleaners, I mean, here we're using bike spray, which is actually a water displacer, come cleaner, come lubricant. If we spray this on, there's a good chance that we're going to contaminate the disc on the other side, which is okay because we're going to thoroughly clean the disc before we put it back in, but you really want to try and get absolutely the minimum amount on here so as to not contaminate the disc too badly. So I'm just going to wipe all the old grease or old lubricant off of here before we put the cassette back on, and then we're going to make sure that we give that rotor a good clean with disc brake cleaner before we put it back into the caliper. Okay, so now we've got the cassette all cleaned up, used a good quality degreaser to get all the gunk off the cassette. When you're refitting it back on, you'll notice on the free hub body that there's one wide portion and there's one wide tooth on the actual cassette itself. So there's only one way that a cassette can go onto a free hub body, and that's to line up the wide tooth with the wide hole. Yeah. Okay, now we want to get the next cassette. Now you'll notice that there's markings on there, these chiselled edges for the shifting. So you can only put the cassette sprocket on one way. You could put it on back to front, but the shifting wouldn't be quite as sweet. So always make sure that all the markings are facing out on your cassette. And last but not least, the lock ring. Okay, so because we've now had some degreasers and some cleaners around the hub and cassette area, it's going to be really important to make sure that this rear disc is absolutely mint before it goes back between the pads. We put brand new pads in the caliper, the last thing we want to do is contaminate the pads with an oily or a dirty rotor. So again, we're going to take some disc brake cleaner, spray it around, maybe even spray some on our workshop towel. Okay, now we've cleaned the disc, we can leave that for a minute for the disc brake cleaner to evaporate, and then it'll be ready to go straight back in the bike. Okay, so while we're putting the whole bike together, we thought we'd treat it to some new tyres as well. So take the old tyre off. Most tyres you can get off with your hands nowadays. If you can't get off with your hands, you can use a tyre lever. Tube out, old tyre off. So at this point I'll probably go around and check the rim tape, make sure the rim tape A is in good position in the centre of the rim to cover the nipples, B to make sure it's not damaged in any way. This one's got a little bit of water on it, so I'm just running my fingers around just to get any moisture or dirt off. And then when we're ready to go, new tyre. Most tyres are directional, so you want to be checking the markings on the side of the tyre for a little arrow to tell you what way it's going to go, front or rear. And a little tip that I use, if you've got a little coloured marking on the side of the tyre, always put that where your valve is, so that if you need to change your tyre in a hurry, you don't need to look for the valve, you can just look for the marking on the sidewall of the tyre. So to put the tyre on, you want to get half the bead. Get your tube. Again, check your tube, make sure that there's no contamination on the tube. All you need is a couple of little bits of rock or whatever that's snuck in under the tyre bead, and it could cause a puncture straight away. So, valve in. At this point you want to make sure the tube's partially inflated. You just want a little bit of air in there. And you can also use, if you haven't got a good quality tube that comes pre-talced, you can use a little bit of talcum powder on the tube, which stops the tube sticking to the inside of the tyre and causing friction. So sometimes a little bit of talcum powder on the tube is a good tip. So a lot of people have a different way of doing it. I work towards the valve, so I go round towards the valve. Last bit of tyre should be quite easy to get on. And then last tip, seat the valve, so you actually push the valve up into the tyre and then pull it back down. If it's a pressed tube like this one, make sure you don't damage the valve core when you're pushing it in and out. Okay, this tyre was pretty easy to go on, but some of the bigger downhill tyres can be sometimes a much tighter fit to stop them rolling off of the rim at high speed. And if that's the case, if you're struggling to get that last bit of the tyre on, what you can actually do, if you get the valve at the bottom, you can actually roll the tyre and kind of feed it round, and that way you're pushing any excess towards the valve where you want to be getting it on. So basically push it round, feed it on, and then that last little bit should be easy just to pop over. Some people use tyre levers to put a tyre on, but you normally find that you end up pinching the tube, so it's always best to use your hands to get tyres on. Tyre levers are good for getting them off, wouldn't recommend them for getting them on. It would be the same principle for getting a heavy duty tyre off of the rim. If you're really struggling with a tight tyre and you're struggling to get it off, same thing, you can roll it round and try and get it to give you that little bit of extra slack at one end to get it out. So push the tyre round, and if you're struggling with one tyre lever, you can use 2 or sometimes 3 tyre levers. It's normally best to use these resin tyre levers. They're very strong nowadays, and the metal tyre levers that are on the market, they can actually cause quite a lot of damage to the rims. So I'd normally recommend a high quality plastic resin tyre lever to get them off. Okay, now we're going to try and line up the disc brakes, get them working properly. So all we're doing at this point is putting the wheels in the frame, and now the wheels are in, we are going to drop the bike on the floor, because unless the bike's on the floor, it's pretty difficult to see if the wheels are in absolutely square. So bike on the deck, make sure the wheels are in square. Then it can go back up into the stand. And now we're ready to space and shim the disc brakes. Okay, so now we're going to shim the disc brake system, and what we mean by that is we have the caliper attached to the fork, disc in the middle, but normally with this type of mount you have to put a series of shims in between the caliper and the fork mount in order to make it completely square over the rotor. So we're going to tighten down the disc brake bolts. The reason I've got this white bit of paper in my hand is if I look through and put that behind, I can already see that I've probably got to put about 0.75 of a millimetre in to move it across where I want it to be. Now there's different shim systems on the market. Here I'm going to be using these open shims because this way you haven't got to take the bolts out of the caliper every time to put spacers behind, so solid washers. So these ones you can just put in like little forks to space it out. I've got two different sizes. They only make these in two different sizes. There's a small cutout on this one. This is a thicker shim, and this thinner shim doesn't have a cutout. On the round washer style shims that you can get on the market, it's really important you don't mix those up. If you do mix those up, you're going to need one of these to measure the thickness of each shim. For example, Hope shims and Magura shims are actually a different width, so even though they might feel quite different, if you actually measure them digitally, then you will find sometimes a 0.25 or a 0.005 difference. Now if you put 4 or 5 shims top and bottom that are different widths, there's no way that's going to give you perfect alignment. So I'm going to use these shims because they're easy to fit, and there's only two different sizes, so they're easy to identify, and it shouldn't take a few minutes to get this completely where we want it to be. Okay, so the first thing we've got to do is just to loosen off our caliper bolts. Now I reckon that we're going to try first two of these thicker shims. These ones actually come from Shimano, and it's a Shimano disc brake system that we're using. So I'm just going to put those in and nip that up, and two shims in the bottom. Just going to nip those up, not too tight. And then we're going to recheck our alignment. So what I'm looking for an equal distance to the centre of the disc, but that's an equal distance between the caliper body sides, not the pads, because sometimes the pistons can be sticking out of the caliper one way or the other. So you're looking for the rotor relative to the caliper body, and you want it to be bang in the middle. I'm looking between the caliper body now, and as you can see with the camera, we've got perfect alignment. Okay, this rear caliper alignment was a bit simpler because the top caliper here has the ability to swivel on the bracket below. So what we generally find here is if you undo the bolts and you pull the brake on, then it will self-center. Again, you just got to make sure that one piston isn't coming out more than the other on one side of the caliper. What we have noticed though is that because we're using an old rotor, the actual rotor itself, the disc, is a little bit warped. So Andy's going to give the rotor a little tweak, and this is literally just finding the bent point of the rotor and using an adjustable spanner just to tweak it straight. To find the bent spot, just spin the rotor around and you'll see it like a buckled wheel. You'll see it just catch the pad every revolution, and then all you do, you can be quite forceful but don't go too crazy, just give it a tweak and you should be able to pull it straight. You can't get every rotor straight every time, but you can certainly make a bit of an emergency fix. If you've shimmed your caliper correctly and the rotor is exactly in the middle of the caliper but you still have some rub on the pads, that normally means that one of the pistons or both of the pistons are coming further or closer out of the body than the other. So if you're happy that the disc is bang in the middle of the caliper, what you can do is this little trick to even up the caliper and pad retraction. So Andy's going to show, going down here, we've got a little bit of rub on one side.
You need two people.
Yeah, you do need two people. Andy's actually going to hold the disc against the piston that's coming out too far, and I'm going to pull the pads on and off, pull the master cylinder lever in and out. And what we hope that's going to do is basically even the pistons up. So what you're doing is the disc is actually pushing, one piston's doing more work than the other. So all we're doing is using the disc to push one piston back into the body to allow the other one to come out further. And that's how you can even the pistons up. So just use the disc. Although don't push too hard on the disc, because you can bend them if you're not too careful. Okay, while Andy's just faffing around with the cables, trying to get them through the frame, I'm just going to make sure that the derailleur hanger hasn't got damaged in transit. This is the last part of our frame preparation. This is a specialist tool. You would need to get a shop to do this. So just going to screw that in where the mech would normally go, the rear derailleur. And what I'm going to do is just line that up with the wheel at the bottom. It's obviously important to make sure the wheel's in square and make sure the wheel's not too buckled. And we're just going to make sure that as we go round it's pretty even. Now this is an interesting one. As you can see, we've got a gap here at the top of approximately 10 mil, about a centimetre, and at the bottom we've got pretty much no gap. So that means that this hanger, even though it's a brand new frame, this may got damaged in transit and it's a little bit bent, and that would affect the shifting quality when you're riding the bike. So all we're going to do now is just tweak that out. Yep, now the gap's about the same top and bottom. Okay, just going to talk you through some adjustments on the rear derailleur. Now this is what we call a rapid rise derailleur, which actually works in a different way. So as you push the shifter, rather than pull the chain up the cassette, here it pulls it down the cassette. But the fundamental adjustments are the same. On the back of the derailleur here you've got two set screws. There's a high and a low. Now these two screws indicate where the jockey wheels line up with the top and the bottom sprockets. Now as we can see here, if I push that across all the way, that goes way past this bottom sprocket. So what we need to do in this case is we need to adjust this one here, which has got H, which is for high. I'm basically going to screw that in until that jockey wheel lines up with the bottom sprocket. This one here is the low tension screw, so that indicates this top sprocket here, the low gear, and if I screw that in or out, that will allow this jockey wheel or the whole derailleur itself to move further away from this point here. So these two screws set the jockey wheels relative to the large and the bottom cassette sprockets. Now this little screw here, this is called the B tension. Now you wouldn't normally spend too much time adjusting this, but what that basically does is it pulls the jockey wheels away from the cassette. And the idea with the B tension is you want to get the jockey wheels as close to the cassette as you can without touching, because that will allow the maximum potential for chain to wrap around the sprocket without causing any interference with the jockey wheels. Okay, now we've got the outer casing through the frame. It's really important to get a good length of out casing. You want a nice mellow bend in the cable, not so long as you can hang your washing off of it, not so tight that it's going to make the cable too kinked. There you go, that's too tight, that's too long. About there, nice mellow loop, that'll do you. We're going to put new cables in the shifters, and he's just taking the little dust cover off the shifter. My top tip would be to always use best quality gear cables you can get. Even the most expensive gear cables on the market are only a couple of quid each, but always choose a good brand name cable. Try not to use the sort of cheap and cheerful cables, because they do stretch quite easily and also they do get kinked quite easily. Just while Andy's doing the gear cables, I'm just going to put some bar end plugs here in the handlebars. These are lock-on grips, but it's always good to cover the end of your bars. They won't let you race if the bars aren't covered, mainly because if you come down you could quite easily rip yourself open on a sharp end of a handlebar. So get yourself a nice quality bar end plug and whack it in, and you're nice and safe.
Right, ideally to get the correct chain length, Shimano recommend that you put the gears in the smallest ring at the front and the smallest ring at the rear, and then your chain should just put a little bit of tension when you put it together onto the derailleur here. So you see the derailleur, it's got some tension on it now. Okay, this is a special joining pin that you use on a Shimano chain. That bit's a slightly smaller diameter to this part of the pin, so it pushes through with your fingers. And you put the tool on, screw it in. That first part goes through nice and easy, but now the second part, as it goes through, is tighter, so it's joining the chain correctly. Once you've got that in all the way, this part then you need to just snap off. I use the end of the chain tool here, and that's your chain joined together. Okay, there you saw how to join the Shimano chain with the pin. This is actually a lot easier. This is a SRAM chain, and with the SRAM chain you get a power link which looks like this. Okay, so you don't need a special tool to take your chain off the bike or put it back on once it's been cut to length. To cut it to length you need the chain tool, but it's as simple as that. Okay, so earlier you saw Clive setting the high and the low settings on the rear derailleur. Now we've got to set the indexing in between on each of these teeth here. So if I click through the gears, you can see that it's not going up to the next one, so I need to adjust the cable tension to get this chain to jump up onto the next cog there. So this is the cable tension adjuster, see me turning. Right, now it's going up onto that cog. Now I've noticed that it's actually over shifting. Instead of going one tooth at a time, one cog at a time, it's going two. So I've got to pull a little bit more cable tension to prevent it from jumping two teeth. See, it's jumped back down to that tooth, so the indexing should be about right now. But if you adjust this barrel adjuster, you'll see that if I screw that in, see it's taking it out to the next cog. If I back it out again, it's taking it down. If I go too far the other way, I'll take it down to that cog. So you pretty much know when you got the tension correct. Okay, you're going to talk a little bit about maintenance. It's very important that you maintain your bike. Probably the most important part to maintain and keep clean and lubricated is your chain, which is your drive train here. You can get a chain cleaner like this. Makes life a lot easier cleaning your bike and maintaining it. Literally, you have to put it in the middle chain ring and the middle of the cassette, so that when you back pedal the bike, which you have to do with this chain cleaner, it does it nice and evenly and your chain's not going all over the place. So it just clips on there like that. Clips together, but you have to put a little bit of degreaser in here. I'm not going to do it inside, should do it outside. Then all you need to do, once you've got the degreaser in there, rotate it 20 times with the degreaser in there. Once you take it off, you then rinse the degreaser off with water, and it's like you've got a new chain. And it's important then to clean the rest of the bike using the correct cleaning products. This is a cleaning kit by Muck-Off. It's got all the things you're going to need in here. Sponge, brushes, it's got the Muck-Off, which is superb for cleaning. All you need to do with Muck-Off is spray it on the bike, on the frame, on the forks, all over the bike. Leave it on for a few seconds and then rinse it off with water. And you can use the brush or the brushes to just agitate any dirt that's on there, and then rinse it off, and that's it. You've got a clean bike. It's important to keep your bike clean and up together, because if there's any damage on the bike anywhere, you'll be able to see that quite soon. I.e. if there's a crack in the frame or something and the bike's covered in dirt, you're not going to know about it until maybe the frame fails. But also you can see wear and tear on your drivetrain, on your brakes. It's actually important to keep these sort of areas on your fork and on your rear shock clean around these seals, because if dirt sort of builds up on there, it can get inside the seals and damage the forks, and you don't want that because that's going to cost you a lot of money to repair. So it's important to clean this area as well. And then you can use like a Teflon based lubricant on there, and then it just helps it all keeps it running smooth. Once you've cleaned your bike and your chains free of grime and grease, you've got to re-lubricate it. Now you can get aerosols, but we don't recommend aerosols because you can spray lube across onto, say, the disc brake, and you don't want oil on your disc brake because it's not going to work. The best lubes really are for wet weather. You can use a wet lube like this. It stays on longer in bad conditions, but if it's dry, I'd always recommend to use a dry lube because it's much cleaner running, and there's a less chance of getting this lube on your disc brake because it dries like a wax once you've applied it. Now you saw myself and Clive building this bike up from a new frame. If it were an old frame, I would always recommend to inspect the pivot point area, which is here. Basically I would take the end cap off here, inspect the bearing, see if there's any corrosion, and put the bike on the floor and wobble the back wheel as well, because if you've got any movement here, that means there's a problem with the bearing. You need to get that looked at straight away. Replace the bearing if necessary. If you are fitting the bearing yourself, I mean, some of these bikes you will need to take it to a dealer to get them to replace the bearing because you need special presses. But if you do it yourself, I'd always put a small amount of grease on the bearing area and then on the cap, the pinch bolt area, just to prevent any creaking and keep moisture out. At least once a year you should get your suspension, whether it be a rear shock or your front forks, inspected and serviced annually. Basically, I mean, we do a lot of high-tech work on bikes in the shop here, but we would always send a rear shock to the correct service centre, whether it be Tim Fluke's, definitely suspension forks. We'd send them all to Tim because he basically knows everything there is to know about tuning forks and servicing forks.
Okay, so I'm Clive and this is Andy. Again, we're from Bike Lab in Poole, and tonight we've taken one old bike and moved all the parts onto this new bike, and I hope you've picked up some good tips along the way. So thanks for tuning in.